Behold the one... Behold the one... I have talked about this before, but I feel like it deserves its own video because of how absurd it is that this once existed. What you are looking at is a locomotive. Indeed. Constructed by the Holeman Locomotive Company in 1887 in Philadelphia. Those that looked at it and knew what they were looking at simply referred to it as the Holeman Horror, because what is that? Also, why? Well, there have been many who have come forward saying, "Aha! I know what this is for, darkness. It's had a very good reason for existing, absolutely 100%. Obviously, this was meant to be an experimental way to change gauges on the rails, without actually altering the locomotive. You could put them on stilts and run them on a bunch of little wheels. Yeah, that's not what this is for at all. It was never what this was for. It wasn't even suggested at any point by anyone, except for you, smart guy. And I understand you're just trying to find logic in a place that has none, and it's not your fault. It's no one's fault but Holman. Because, alright, so the whole concept of this locomotive, as far as advertising it was concerned, and seeking investors, more on that later, is that apparently by adding all these additional wheels underneath the main ones, you would actually make the locomotive go faster. Why anyone with any rational amount of thought would think that that would work is anyone's guess, because that's just not how physics operate. It might go the same speed, but it sure as heck won't go any faster. Nor would it increase the tractive effort. In fact, it probably would have lowered that, since with all these additional wheels, there's more surfaces that are prone to slipping. Doubtless some of you are curious as to the wheel arrangement of this madness. And if you count the wheels that are actually on the rails, it's a 6-12-0. Which is already an absurd thing to say. If you count all the wheels, it would be a 10-18-0. But I don't think that makes much sense to do it that way. 6-12-0 is probably the best case scenario, and yeah, it was actually built, and it was advertised as being faster than a conventional locomotive. Why did they actually think that? Well, the answer is they didn't actually think that. They didn't actually think that at all. No one who built this thing actually thought that was the case. What they were doing was a story we've heard often enough around here, an investor scam. That's all this was. You have to understand that back in the 1800s, locomotives were all the rage when it came to investments. People were becoming filthy, stinking rich off of the railroads. The rise of multiple tycoons in the industry, all vying for their place. And builders and locomotive types, of course, were also making a truckload of money at the time because it was new technology and it was very effective technology. It was clearly the way of the future. And it really was. The railroads changed the entire landscape of long-distance transportation. Prior to them, the best way to get across, say, America was by wagon. And that could take weeks, at minimum, possibly months, depending on how far you were going, where you were going, the weather, so many different factors. But railroads changed such journeys, lowering them to as little as a few days. And as trains got faster, that got even less. It was remarkable. Mass transit, mass communication, including things like, the mail. I mean, things were changing. We're becoming much more connected than we once were, as nations and all over the world. So, naturally, people wanted to invest in the industry, but not everyone fully understood the intricacies of how the technology worked, or what made for a competent, logical locomotive, because it was new, and not everyone was familiar with it. Now we can look back on this and laugh hysterically, because this is obviously ridiculous. But back then, not everyone knew how a locomotive was supposed to function, and any new idea seemed like it must be the next big thing, and no one wanted to miss out. So people threw their money at it. And it's not something we're unfamiliar with today, it just doesn't happen with locomotives anymore, really. It happens with a lot of other new technology. Dare I mention crypto around here? Can we talk about the crypto craze for a second? I mean, Bitcoin's rise in terms of value sparked how many crypto scams? How many different times have people gotten bamboozled because they hear the word crypto and think that just prints money magically? So they throw their actual money into it, only for whatever it is to crash, and the actual person that made the coin to run away with all the investors' money they sent to them. Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, this kind of thing happens now. All the time. NFTs? Do we want to talk about those too? No? Or AI. Oh god, AI's the big craze now. Anything with the word AI next to it automatically attracts mass investors, even if it isn't always even AI. I mean, there was at least one case, where a dude was claiming to have this AI system set up. In reality, he was paying actual real people in India at a call center to do it, to pretend they were AI. Like, my point is, investor scams are nothing new, and they're much, much easier to pull off if the general public, or investors as a whole, don't actually fully grasp the technology, or understand what makes it good, or a whole bunch of things. Locomotives were no exception, and the Holeman Horror is one of the most grievous examples of investor fraud when it comes to building a locomotive. Because again, this is absurd. There was no way this was going to be effective at anything, except maybe the gauge changing idea, but even that, this couldn't have been an effective solution. Because, well, look at it. Honestly, I'm more concerned about it being too top heavy. Like, you're putting the center of mass way high up for no reason. I mean, I think that would be more liable to turn over, right? It can't just be me thinking that, alright? Now, the other thing about this locomotive is that people will often look at it, say all that, and call it a day. And that's fair, because there aren't that many verifiable sources about the history of its inventor. But I, finally, after a long time of knowing about this engine but not having any solid details, have actually found a source that lists the life of one William Jennings Holman. Oh yes, we have a face, people! Before we get to William, let's discuss his father, Joseph. Joseph Holman was, well, kind of sketchy too. Apparently born in Kentucky, but traveling with his parents and siblings to Indiana sometime after 1800, his youth is shrouded in somewhat of a mystery. While he started his life doing honest work, Holman would eventually just decide, actually, I'm just gonna start ripping people off, or just skirting around the law either way. For example, he would settle in Richmond, Indiana, and he was registered as what's known as an Indian trader. Someone who was allowed to trade with the local Native Americans. However, it actually wasn't legal to sell them liquor. But, much later it would be shown that the town's government in general was basically ignoring the fact that most of the traders were doing that exact thing. And it's believed that Holman likely was doing it, because that's just who he was. He also worked at the land office, where he would basically do insider trading, speculating on land values because he had insider information. For example, in 1827, he would make a deal with one of the local chiefs of a Native American tribe to purchase a section of their land for $500. Part of that value was going to be paid in goods, not cash. The deal would go through, but then he would turn around and sell part of the land for basically the same amount he had bought the whole thing from to a man named William N. Hood. In early 1829, he would lose his federal position, removed from his office by the new president, Andrew Jackson. But eventually he found his way into the Indiana State Land Office, not just the local one, where he once again started using this insider status to get favorable deals. But he was actually caught this time, and a $4,721 judgment was levied against him. In case you think this guy's just a total scumbag, he did have his good points. Holman was very much against slavery, for example, and his home was considered a station on the Underground Railroad. He didn't care for Native Americans very much, though. So it's one of those weird things where it's like, are you prejudiced? Well, yes, but only against them. You people are fine and deserve to be treated fairly. So you're splitting the hairs here. I don't even know, man. Most of his early scams were committed against Native Americans, so yeah, I mean that tracks. Did he help the slaves? Yes. Did he screw over the Native Americans? Also, yes, he did both of those things, so there you go. But that's only what the senior Holman did. But his son, William, wasn't really interested in politics, though he was interested in the scam. William preferred the idea of technology, and he pursued a career, an honest one, as a civil engineer. He landed a job as a junior assistant surveyor, working for the state government, through his family connections at just the age of 19, working on the canal system. At the time that William was doing this, Indiana only had a single railroad, the Madison and Indianapolis. As back then, it was pretty difficult to put a railroad in Indiana. They just didn't really have the money. And there wasn't a lot of money coming into the area back then. In fact, while physically it had the Madison and Indianapolis, there were plenty of other paper railways. Basically, railways that had been established on paper and were planned, but hadn't actually been built because they just didn't have the funding. A lot of these were supposed to be honest attempts, and one of these attempts did involve William Holman. His plan, along with several others, was to connect a railroad between Peru and Indianapolis, with 70 miles of railroad. This was in 1846. But their route was questionable at best. There were only a handful of towns on the planned route to begin with. Smaller businessmen in the area also rose a stink about this because they were things like wagon freighters and innkeepers who knew that a railroad, because it was much faster, would basically throw them out of business. It's not known if Holman was the one that came up with the idea, but he was definitely very much a pusher behind it. And it was to be called the Peru and Indianapolis Railroad, incorporating in 1847. But much like plenty of the other paper railroads, they just flat out didn't have the money. Still, they put their first stock offering forward in April of 1847, but sales receipts of those stock offerings were well short of what they actually needed because most people just didn't have confidence in the idea. It was a bad route. They turned to the local counties for subsidies and continued to press for donations of land as part of the right-of-way, but that never really amounted to much. Believe it or not, though, they did attempt to start construction. Contractors started on the 21 miles that was to be between Indianapolis and Noblesville. Sometime between 1848 and 1850, sources differ on exactly when it would be, but it was somewhere around there. And that part of the job was finished in 1851. Holman decided to also put the title of chief engineer onto his resume around then, even though, no, you were not the, well, I guess you were kind of, despite the fact that the line was there and was technically usable, it was very slapped together. The rails consisted of wooden stringers topped by strap iron bars that were left over from the Madison and Indianapolis. They were second-hand. This particular rail design wasn't considered very good or effective, which is why M&I had stopped using them. And this is because they had a tendency to warp. Derailments happened all the time, to the point that it was standard issue for the trains operating on the line to carry jacks, wooden blocks, and basically a whole bunch of other tools that would help, put them back on the rails after they got thrown off of them. It was ridiculous. Holman had been the manager, and the railway suffered a lot of financial problems because, frankly, he was bad at this. Eventually, it was decided that the Madison and Indiana would actually take over operations, and Holman was effectively dismissed. As it turned out, M&I was not quite clued in on the fact that most of P&I's problems weren't necessarily all Holman's fault. I mean, some of them were, but not all of them. They were operating at a loss, and when the line was actually completed, M&I mortgaged them for $500,000 to pay off the work that had been done. Eventually, P&I would go straight up bankrupt, and M&I would release control over them after only 8 months because, no. Additionally, when it came to Holman, in 1852, as part of a condition of granting a subsidy, the Howard County officials had required Holman, as well as other officers of the P&I, to all post bonds as insurance against, not completing the line. Holman had to post $4,000, which he just didn't have, so his dad footed the bill after borrowing the money from a banker friend of his. The line was finished, so that meant that Holman would get back his money, right? But for some reason, M&I got the refund rather than Holeman, and they refused to give it to him, justifying their decision with the fact that it was his management that had caused P&I to be in such a horrible state to begin with. Which was probably true, but also it wasn't actually legal for them to do that. Holman would sue and win, but apparently they never gave the money back to that banker friend. So, yeah, it was great. Despite the fact that success could not be used to describe the P&I in any sense of the word, it had taught Holman quite a bunch of things regarding the railroad industry and railroad financing and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he started working with what was called the Fort Wayne and Southern Railroad. This was yet another paper railroad that never actually amounted to anything. I mean, at least P&I did lay track. It was bad track, but it was still track. But over time, the rails still weren't laid, and they were actually getting a decent amount of money from investors, yet not actually using it to lay track and, set up a railroad. This suggested that at some point they had decided, actually, I think the secret ingredient is crime. And then they brought Holman on board, and that got way worse. Technically speaking, the company's irregular activities dated all the way to its first day of existence, January 15, 1849. The Indiana State Legislature granted it a special charter to form a railroad corporation. And that would be normal, but under state law, that had to be formally accepted by the grantee in order for it to actually go into effect. The founders of the railroad, as well as Holman, didn't actually do that. They just started buying up land and selling stock without official sanctions, because they hadn't accepted it. Which is really weird because, you had gotten it. It was granted. You just had to go formally accept it. And you never bothered to do that. It wasn't until they got to early 1852 that they even started conducting a proper survey between the contemplated endpoints. They just bought up whatever the heck they fancied, apparently. Joseph Holman, the father, remember, actually had a spot on the illegitimate board, and W.J. Holman would start working for the railroad in late March of 1852. He was conducting a survey. He described the route as pretty much straight and flat, so a perfect route for a railway, so there shouldn't be any problem. There would have to be a handful of bridges over some small bodies of water, and according to his calculations, the total cost for actually doing it would be about, $388,397.70 if they used flat bar-topped wooden rail. It would be $574,498.28 if compound rail was used. There was also the option of, T-rail, which was the industry standard at the time. But Holman dismissed it, even though it was much less expensive than compound rail. He felt that compound was far superior to all other forms of rail. Everyone should be using compound, even though it was wildly more expensive, obviously. And the T-rail was perfectly effective. There was no reason to not use the T. He also likely had some intents that were dubious and self-serving because he was working on his own patent for his own variation of compound rail. So if he convinced the railroad to use it, he could possibly get a contract to supply it himself. But his estimations, some of you may have noticed, are weird because they're down to the penny. Estimations don't do that. That's not usually how they're done because, they're estimations. Obviously, costs are going to go up and down. It's going to vary. But you usually give someone a dollar amount, a rough dollar amount, not down to the exact penny. On top of this, he also added a blurb regarding the extra bits that would be needing to go with the railroad and said that no estimate can be made with any certainty of the cost of station buildings, car houses, and other railroad fixtures, excepting the designs of the company for which they may be intended are fully matured and decided upon. In public, perhaps more than in private life, a taste for the substantial, grand, or magnificent is cultivated and indulged in more or less indifferent instances, in proportion to the real or supposed, present or anticipated means or resources of the parties in the given case. I'm only halfway through that, and I already hate it. Basically, he's saying, I have no idea how much it's going to cost, but it might be around $100,000. That's pretty much how he ends it. And that's ridiculous. You know it, I know it, let's just press forward. Obviously, he didn't really do the survey properly, because, duh. And even though they accepted the estimate, work didn't even get started until April of 1853. And I mean the absolute minimum amount of work. They really didn't do much of anything. Bidders on it were required to take at least 20% of their payment in stock, not cash. And part of the issue may have been that the company, despite having a lot of investors, had a lot of land, but didn't have a lot of cash left. They had spent it, or probably just taken it for themselves, honestly, meaning that they couldn't actually afford to pay the contractors outright, so they were pushing their stock rather than, actually paying them anything tangible. And mind you, this railroad was only meant to connect two towns whose sum total population at the time was less than 5,000 people. That's it. Well, how did they get so much investor then? Well, that's because the initial pitch had the railroad going much further than that, but they scaled things down as they spent the money on stuff they shouldn't have spent it on, or just took it, as one does. And Holman was eventually made president of the company. He would make a whole bunch of proposals. Some were just absurd. One involved building a tunnel under the river immediately above the falls of the Ohio that lay between the two towns, rather than building a bridge over it like a normal, rational human being. There was no reason to build a tunnel under it. But he sold it on the idea that it would be cheaper to do this, when no, it would not. Yet everyone thought that, oh, that makes a lot of sense, Holman. You seem like a real smart guy. No, this was stupid. But they got it approved by the Kentucky legislature, and it went ahead, at least at first. See, well, they managed to convince the politicians it was a good idea, and they would let them do it. They wouldn't give them public money to do it. That's where they were like, oh, no. No, we're not going to give you tax money for the what? No, that'll be ridiculous. Do it yourselves. You guys got money, right? No, they didn't have anything. So they couldn't get money from the government, and they didn't have much money left on their own. They could have mortgaged their land, but that would have made too much sense. So instead, they decided they were going to print their own money. What? Okay, let me try to explain this. This was being done during the free banking era of American history, between the 1830s and 1860s. Federal currency, which is what we use now, was actually hard to come by in more remote areas of the nation. So the people had to use something to trade money, they had to do that. In order to alleviate this issue, Congress allowed banks and railroad companies the right to print their own currency with the general proviso that they were sufficiently backed to allow note holders to redeem them on demand. Basically, they could print their own money, but it had to be backed by something, and it had to be worth what they said it was. This resulted in a lot of what were called wildcat banks, which were chartered and regulated by the state legislatures, not the federal. And oversight of those banks was pretty chaotic. It depended on the state. Some were pretty good at it, others not so much. Indiana was not one of the ones that were good at this. Their oversight was basically non-existent. And people weren't stupid. Plenty of the citizens tried to avoid getting a hold of that kind of currency because they knew it probably wasn't worth friggin' anything. But true to form, the Fort Wayne and Southern Railroad started issuing their own notes in $1, $3, and $5 denominations, bearing Holman's signature, and thrown out into the wild in September of 1854. They used this money often to pay off their own contractors, and it wasn't very good for much because it wasn't really backed by anything, they just said it was. But according to the terms, anyone holding a note could exchange it for actual US currency at the FW&S main offices. But the railroad reserved the right to give them cash, which is what they wanted, land or real estate bonds in trade, as they decided to do. Meaning that if you went with one of these bills to go get actual money you could actually use somewhere, they weren't going to give you actual money. That just didn't happen. And they were still pushing the tunnel idea too. Holman used his family's political connections to coerce the Indiana governor, Joseph A. Wright, to travel down to Louisville to pitch the railroad to a group of investors standing outside the financial markets. Holman brought a map and stood before the crowd at the Merchants Exchange to describe the details of the tunnel and got a whole bunch of investor money for something that would never actually happen. Things were getting more and more out of control for the company, and honestly, I could keep going into detail, but basically, everything went bad. And the whole thing was over by 1858. For the next few years, he seemed to have just used the money he made off of the railroad debacle, and Well, he attempted a bunch of other stuff. He tried to get into politics, and that didn't really work too well. Then he tried to get into prospecting, which that didn't work either. He got married, and that actually went really well. Not really, he had a very happy marriage with his wife, Kate. So, yeah, that's nice. He tried to organize a buffalo drive that didn't work, because it was a stupid idea. The way he handled it was stupid, very stupid. Mostly because he was trying to drive buffalo. Buffalo don't like being driven. Buffalo will kill you. Like, it's just no one took him up on this offer. And then he remembered, wait, I'm not good at any of this other stuff. You know what I am great at? Railroads. No, you're not. You're not good at that either. But you're gonna go back to that. In the form of the Grand Narrow Gauge Experiment. Well, that on its own wasn't his idea. But basically, in the early 1870s and mid-1880s, narrow gauge railroads were cropping up everywhere, becoming quite popular in certain aspects. Some were successful, others weren't. And eventually people just kind of stopped doing that, went back to our standard gauge. But people liked it at the time because it was a lot cheaper to build narrow gauge routes than it was the standard. The problem was that they often weren't cheap to operate necessarily. They were pretty much the same to operate. They were just cheap to build in the first place. Holman didn't get involved in this whole nonsense in Indiana until 1878. By that point, the craze was already halfway over, but I guess he got bored. Additionally, what you must know is that at the time, there was a law on the state of Indiana's books that said that an individual could incorporate themselves as a railroad. Yes, you! An individual person, just a dude! You're a railroad now, a whole thing! You're allowed to do that. Apparently. So, naturally, on February 2nd, 1878, William J. Holman walked down to the courthouse in Markle and filed paperwork making himself, Holman, a corporation with the alias Fort Wayne, Markle, and Southwestern. Markle, mind you, at the time, only had a population of 220 people? It was very small. It didn't even have a saloon. A saloon wasn't in the town. These people can't even go out and drink. Like, what the heck is going on in Markle? The answer was nothing. So why the heck would he even want to incorporate there? Well, most theories point to the fact that Holman liked taking advantage of people, and he probably figured that the people in this rural community probably just didn't know any better, or know who he was. He, in fact, boasted that he already obtained $25,000 in funding, which, no, he did not. Also, even if it was true, $50,000 was the minimal requirement for incorporation. You couldn't actually incorporate even as an individual if you didn't have at least $50,000 to put forward. So, he simply lied again and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, actually, it's $50,000. I definitely have that much." And he was deliberately vague when it came to how the railroad was going to be built. Basically, he outlined which counties the lines would pass through, but didn't get, super specific beyond that, leaving the investors to connect the dots. And because he was so vague, that basically allowed him to manipulate markets, with communities and sometimes even individual people competing with each other over the potential right-of-way and the shops and depot locations. And people were attracted to his idea because it was narrow gauge, which was all the rage at the time. But of course, as we all know, this was all kind of a massive scam. But he actually didn't even get approval to survey it properly, so he couldn't even attempt to construct. It could be argued whether or not he even intended to at all, but the point is he couldn't even try. And eventually the company's board would, stop being a thing. And then Holman incorporated himself again as the Fort Wayne, Warren, and Brazil Railroad. Despite being a separate entity, it was pretty much exactly the same as his initial proposal. The only major difference was that this new railroad would run north of Indianapolis instead of through it. And when everything went under with the initial railroad, Holman allowed people to trade in the worthless stock from that situation for more worthless stock in the new railroad certificate. You're just trading nothing for nothing, come on! By 1881, people started asking a lot of questions, though, as he got pretty quiet after a while after taking a whole bunch of investor money. And by April of that year, investors had filed 5 separate lawsuits to recover the funds. Those lawsuits reveal that he had started a securities racket, focusing on people that weren't normal investors, basically just regular people, like, just kicking around, who he was trying to scam out of even more money. And the whole thing continued for a few more years until eventually that railway also went under because it wasn't actually going to be built at all. He had to settle various different lawsuits in the late 1880s because, duh. But Holman generally just skipped out on the whole, courtroom thing and moved to Minneapolis. He had moved there in 1885 rather than, deal with any of the consequences of his actions. And in the middle of trying to organize his own railroad, and by that I mean scam people out of money to organize his own railroad, he'd also filed a bunch of patents for new inventions for the railway. He was awarded a patent in 1879 for a new design for a rail. He'd already attempted to do this earlier with his own interpretation of a compound rail system, but none of his designs actually meant anything. They weren't any better. They were in fact a lot worse than the rails that the railroads were using at the time. And now we can finally move on to why you're all here. What the heck is that? Well, that is our great Holman's final experiment. The thing that he is most known for. His horror. Not content to do this once. No. They did it twice. The Holeman Horror had a effective sister. This one was constructed in 1897, believe it or not, by Baldwin. They contracted Baldwin to do it, meaning they must have made enough money to get a second one and try to get even more investor money for this complete fraud. I just wonder what Baldwin was thinking when they got the order for this thing. Like, did any of them think that there was something sketchy going on? Did they question it? Were they like, are you guys sure? Because they had to know this wasn't going to work. Baldwin knew how locomotives work. They were one of the principal manufacturers, and they were a good company. A credible company. Yet somehow Holman convinced them to make this thing, and they certainly did it, and it's slightly different. While the drivers are still on those blasted stilts, the leading wheels are no longer. Why the alteration? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. It's still ridiculous. And it was still meant to just be a scam. He was so sure that he would attract investors for this ridiculous madness that he said they would need 2 factories, 2, to keep up with the orders that he definitely knew were absolutely forthcoming, even though they got none, because no! As far as the fate of the first locomotive, I'm not 100% on, but most sources agree the second one was actually returned to Baldwin, who immediately turned her back into a conventional 440 because they knew this was stupid and ridiculous, and she was then sold to Kansas City and Northern, and likely served them perfectly fine because in that form there was nothing wrong with her, because other than the stilts, there was nothing differentiating these designs between conventional 440s. If you took those away, they were pretty normal. The boilers, the cabs, everything else was pretty standard. They just put them on those things to make them look absurd and attract idiots to throw money at something that was never going to become anything. And if you're wondering, did he really get away with this? Yeah, he did. He really did. Seriously. If anything, he's arguably one of the most successful scammers because he never spent a day in jail to anyone's knowledge, even though all of this, everything I just told you, this is absurd. It was always absurd. He never actually paid for it. He passed away in 1905. Yet his final scam, his final bit of nonsense, still lives on. Talked about today. But say what you will about him, we still remember his absurdity. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.